Good day, folks. Mark Friessen, the Grizzly Patriot, coming at you here. Normally, I'm a live streamer, a content creator, but in this case, I'm creating my content in a recording. Uh, just because I just finished going live and I didn't want to have to suck everyone back into my live feed just to do this. But I wanted to create just a short video relating most, if not all, of the issues that Canadians are experiencing and that's being rammed down our throat across our country. I wanted to relate all of those issues um, to the UN Sustainable Development Agenda because they are all directly related to the goals, the 17 goals and 169 targets of sustainable development. And I'm just going to show you how that lines up, how all of these issues line up with the sustainable development. Now, some will argue that the sustainable development agenda was not agreed to by the Conservative Party, that this is just Trudeau pushing it forward. I can tell you unequivocally that that is not the case, that both our establishment parties are committed to the development agenda and the goals and achieving the goals. They've been on board from early 70s, I'll say, with Papa Trudeau, and it's been in development and creation since then. 92, Mulroney signed it. 2015, Harper signed it. And so it's important for context. Of course, we have to understand historical context to make the present understandable. But rest assured, let's look at some of my other videos. I explain it in depth, the connection between the libs and the cons. It's two wings of the same globalist bird. It's fact. It is what it is. So much so that, and a lot of people don't know this or understand this, but the sustainable development is a commitment made by our establishment governments. And in order to prove that commitment to the UN and the handlers at the UN, our governments had to create an act to actually show that they are committed. And this is the act that was created in 2008. It's the Federal Sustainable Development. And again, in 2008, Harper, of course, was in power at that time. So for those of you who don't think this is real and don't think this is legitimate or some sort of conspiracy theory, it's not. It's been in development for a long time, as I mentioned. It's been in our federal law since 2008. And this one's actually in effect till 2020-01-27. So, well, there's probably a new one, I guess, now because we're in 2020. Last amended 2013. And it's probably been amended or will, like I said, be amended or changed. There's probably a new act that's current, maybe till 2025 or 2030, maybe, who knows. So I guess they'll have to update this. But at any rate, it does exist. There is law in effect, and there wasn't one politician that, came forward to tell the people of what sustainable development is or the consequences thereof. Whether it be a federal politician, a provincial politician, or a municipal politician, because they are all involved and they are all committed. Varying degrees, of course. For instance, Saskatoon has signed on to ICLEI. That's the group of cities that have committed to Agenda 21 and sustainable development. Regina, for example, hasn't been added to that list. They haven't signed on to ICLEI as of yet, to my knowledge. The last time I checked, they weren't on the list. But they are still committed to sustainability and to, fulfilling the commitments that the federal government has committed to us. So So it does exist. I invite you to go check this out. It's right on the Canadian website. I'm not going to go through all this stuff. You're more than welcome to do so. This is imperative that you look at Federal Sustainable Development Strategy. But I encourage everyone to go look at the Act. It's right there on the Justice Laws website, Canadian website. And that'll be there for you to research and study if you feel the need. But I just wanted to show you this to, anybody that suggests that it isn't a commitment committed to by our establishment parties, you're sadly mistaken. Anyways, so here is the list, and the first website that came up, I just grabbed it. I mean, it's everywhere. So this website happens to be companies helping meet the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. So of course, in this website, there's lots of companies. There's 8,000 NGOs that have committed and are part of promoting this thing. It's enormous, and it affects all aspects of our life. Corporations are involved. Local businesses are involved. Your municipalities are involved. Yet the masses have no idea what's happening. Nobody's explained it to them. Nobody's talked to, done a press conference or an education forum or, any of these things explaining, especially from an opposing position, right? And I think if people understood and understand what this all means and how it affects all aspects of our life, they would have a lot of concerns, which is precisely why no politician or the media or anyone else has promoted this thing until now, because they knew they would get strong pushback and strong opposition to it. But the fact still remains, here we are. So I want to go through some of the issues. I wrote a post on Facebook earlier today, and this was the post. I just copied and pasted it into a Word document. So we'll go through these things, and I'm going to relate all of these issues that affect everyone, from one region to the other, from one coast to the other, and just relate them to the sustainable development. So, of course, the first one is national sovereignty. Well, just by the pure nature of this agreement, we lose an incredible amount of sovereignty. By signing on to this agreement, we've essentially put into the hands of a foreign entity, unelected, socialist in nature, creating policies, cookie cutter policies for the planet. And by committing to these goals and implementing the policies to meet these goals and targets, we have put ourselves in a position of much less sovereignty. We now have our governments committed to this foreign entity and its agenda. So the nature of this whole agreement cedes our sovereignty. So there's a lot of these particular goals and their targets that individually take our sovereignty and remove our sovereignty, just based on the policies that will need to be created to fulfill the goals. So that removes their sovereignty as well. But just the whole agenda in its entirety on its own removes an incredible amount of sovereignty just by signing on to it. And if you look back, there's plenty of footage of Stephen Harper saying that we must accept less sovereignty. We must accept the loss of our sovereignty. He said that on camera a number of times. Of course, it's not promoted, and a lot of people don't know that he said that. I have it on my YouTube channel. You can find it there, or just Google it on YouTube. It's there. Liberals, the same thing. I mean, they've said it too. It's not a secret to them. They just try not to promote it too much. But it is affecting our sovereignty in many, 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 many ways. No pipelines. So we're fighting to get pipelines to Tidewater. We're fighting to get our resources to the international market so we get fair value for our resources so we can be prosperous. There's an enormous attack on our energy industry, on oil and gas, on pipelines, on transportation. That is all relative to, of course, the Paris Accord, which is the attack on CO2 being the big enemy. Climate change is the big enemy that we all have to focus on, that we have to go to war over. It's a war against, CO2 and emissions, creating greenhouse gas. Excuse me, creating greenhouse gas effect. And so that's the whole focus. There's a huge attack on, of course, anything that creates CO2 emissions, that being oil and gas. Now, particularly, the Paris Accord would fall under goal number 13. And I'm not going to go through all of the targets of each one. You guys can do that on your own, do your own research, but you can connect your own dots on your own time. I'm just going to be relating these issues to the actual goal. And of course, each one of these goals has, as I mentioned, a number of targets. There's 169 altogether. If you go to each one of these, there's compacts that are developed and signed in relation to these goals, and the Paris Accord is a great example. That's one of the compacts or the accords that is signed. This is one of the most important ones, the Paris Accord, because it is the linchpin. Back in at least 2012, if not earlier, but it was actually listed on the UN website that they created this CO2 taxing specifically to raise funds to fulfill the rest of the agenda, the rest of the goals of this agenda. Takes an incredible amount of money. $4.5 trillion annually is the estimate, and that could be on the low end. But that is the estimate. So it takes an incredible amount of money. So not only are your taxes going in to fund this agenda, but NGOs are raising money, billions upon billions upon billions annually through charity, that type of thing. NGOs are raising funds alongside. So not only are your taxes going to fund this agenda, but also fundraising and charity and NGOs are raising an incredible amount of money to fund this agenda. So when we talk about the climate action and Paris Accord, that is the linchpin. Without that accord, without the ability of nation states, of course, we're moving away from nation states, but they're using nation states right now to raise funding. Without nation states, they don't have an ability to raise enough money if the nation states aren't taxing their people. Now, of course, who are we talking about? Well, we're talking about nations in Western civilization, primarily because that's where most of the wealth is, quote unquote. So it's part of the redistribution of wealth scheme. It's socialism on a global scale. It's take from the wealthy, give to the poor. And so, but it's, again, it's a mechanism to raise funds for this agenda. So that's why I consider that number 13 and the Paris Accord to be the linchpin to this whole agenda, because of the funding and the wealth that's being extracted by using this attack on CO2. But it also reaches further than that, of course, because if we are, a nation that is standing against CO2 emissions, then of course we can't be promoting the transportation or the exploration or the extraction of oil and gas. That would be inconsistent with the goals set out in number 13. So that's why the attack is extended. It's not just about taxing, it's extended to industry that is creating this CO2, not only in the action of extracting this resource, but of course, the selling of the resource, the transporting of the resource, all of these things, and the resource itself, right? So that's why there's such a heavy attack on our energy industry, including pipelines. That's why I say to folks in Alberta who are so upset about pipelines, as I understand, we all understand how hurtful and painful it is for you folks, um, because you're directly affected by this attack on the energy industry. This is much bigger than just pipelines. This is much bigger than just, um, you know, oil rigs and Fort Mac and the oil sands. It's much bigger, but this is a huge part of the puzzle. So understand that no pipelines is directly related to number 13, and of course the Paris Accord. Tanker bans, same thing applies. Everything I just said about pipelines applies to the tanker ban. It's the same, falls into Paris Accord and CO2 and oil and gas being the devil. So we have to limit tanker transportation, right? And of course, it's okay for others to use, those tanker lanes to bring in other goods and to ship coal. The hypocrisy is unbelievable. But suffice it to say, the tanker ban C48, of course, is related to sustainable development directly. Then, of course, in order to protest these pipelines and to create the facade that there is mass support for the banning of pipelines, you have to create protesters. You have to have people that are loud and doing protests, whether that means shutting down bridges, shutting down rail lines, shutting down highways, all of these protests that we're all familiar with. Well, most of these protesters are paid protesters funded by Soros and Rockefeller. Rockefeller, of course, being 100% related to the development of this agenda. Going back to the Club of Rome, 1968 is when they started conceptualizing this. Probably sooner, but at least as a collective, they started promoting and creating this. So, funny enough, the benefit, of course, to the Rockefeller Group is if we don't get our resources to Tidewater, we can continue to sending our resources south of the border at a discounted rate while they refine it in the States and sell it on the open market at a premium. So it's, killing two birds with one stone. That's why it's more than worth having Rockefeller and Soros, billionaires, fund protesters. So they're funding these protesters. They're funding these groups. They created a corporation called Wet'suwet'en, not the actual Indian band, but a fake band called the Wet'suwet'en. It's a corporation. It's an entity that was created so they could oppose pipelines. And that's who funds it. And that's why they're so well organized and orchestrated. It's an orchestrated attack, and it's orchestrated protest. It's not grassroots. It's not the actual natives that live in those areas. It's a fake entity. So anytime you see these protests, and the media, of course, they are complicit. They promote the idea. In fact, so much so there's a media compact that was created at the UN, where media organizations, the big multinationals, they've all signed on to that compact now, and they agree with the compact, and they're playing ball to make sure that the messaging comes out to the masses in the way that they wish it to. So it's not going to be coming out in a critical way, in an investigative way. It's going to come out as it has, and as you'll hear on a regular basis, sustainable development is good. Protesters are good, oil bad, pipelines bad. That's the whole narrative. So that's how pipeline protests are relative to sustainable development. And of course, foreign funding is involved in that. C-48, 69, of course, that's pipelines and tankers. And then you get into C-16, which is your compelled speech legislation, to do with free speech, and actually not only not being able to express your views the way you would like, but it's actually instructing people that they must be compelled to speak in a certain way and address people in a certain way when it comes to genders and transgenders, and which is, of course, also related to sustainable development. Now, this one it falls under probably a number of them, but gender equality is definitely one. Reducing inequalities is definitely one that can be related. Education is definitely related. Of course, they're pushing transgenderism. They're pushing LGBTQ in our schools. So you would definitely, at least 3 of these goals are related. And you'll see, if you went to these discussions and to these commissions and councils at the UN, you'll find that all of these issues, they relate them to sustainable development. So, for instance, toxic masculinity, right? They have a whole committee that deals with toxic masculinity. And so when you then see the media promoting the idea that masculinity is toxic, when you have educators and university professors promoting the idea that masculinity is toxic, that's all related to sustainable development. Now, there's other ways that you can relate that. If this is about busting down traditional family, this is about busting down the heterosexual male, the dominant of the species. They want to emasculate men, because men are ultimately the ones who will fight the hardest and against this agenda, against socialism, against all of these issues. So it's important for them to ensure that they reduce that sense of masculinity, that they eradicate essentially masculinity from the equation to make it much more easy to adopt and implement these policies. So that's all tied together into C-16, of course. The whole narrative on genders and transgenderism and all this narrative is all, of course, directly related. C-71, of course, that's to do with gun rights, and there's going to be more legislation coming. The whole attack on property rights, especially gun rights, falls under something called UNODA. It's a group at the UN, and they've basically had countries sign on to the Small Arms Treaty, which essentially they want to eradicate the stockpiling of small arms, which essentially means they want to control what kind of guns, how many guns an individual keeps for themselves. So you'll hear politicians say, yeah, we still want, hunters can still be hunters, and that's important, blah, blah, blah. But they're going to restrict, of course, all the types of weapons that they deem to be assault weapons, quote unquote. And so they're using that, and that's where this whole agenda comes from. It comes from UNODA and the Small Arms Treaty. Again, go research that. I'm not going to go through each one of these particular, but this is related to, they will relate this to sustainable development goals, and they have. If you go look at the treaty, it says specifically in there that it's related to sustainable development. Now, it'll fall under goal number 16, peace and justice, strong institutions. So that's, if you looked at the targets there, they would line up with some of the language in the Small Arms Treaty. So this is how it's related. Goal number 17. You could also relate it to partnerships for the goals, because this is where you bring in NGOs, this is where you bring in protest groups, this is where you bring in the George Soros and the Rockefellers of the world, who fund the narrative, who fund the propaganda against guns. So, and of course, then if there's responsible consumption, you could probably make an argument that it's related to that as well. Obviously. Then we go on to M103. Again, that's sort of related to 16 when it comes to free speech. Now, again, it would be in falling under 16, peace and justice, strong institutions. Also, most likely relative to reduced inequalities, gender equality, you could make an argument. Decent work and economic growth. The thing is with M103 is this is where we have to discuss really quickly who is the UN. The UN is made up of 195 countries. Of that 195, there's another group called the G77, which is 135 countries, all non-Western countries in that group. They have a very influential role in the development of these goals. They have a lot of influence in creating the policies that come out of these goals. And within that 135, you have 56 plus 1, which is the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. They have an enormous amount of influence on that group of 135, simply because of who they are and what they represent. And they have, of course, a lot of the resources in the world and in the Middle East. So they do wield a lot of power in that group, who then, of course, wields a lot of power overall in the UN. So when you can see the UN, when we talk about the Human Rights Commission, you have countries like Saudi Arabia heading up the Human Rights Commission. Now it's a country of Senegal that's heading up the Human Rights Commission. You have Iran that heads up the Women's Rights Commission, which is, so you begin to understand why that's happening, because of the influence of the groups that I mentioned and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and its affiliation to the G77, which is a group of 135. So that group, 135, has enormous influence on the overall 195 countries that make up the UN. But what's also interesting is within that group of 56 plus 1, so the plus 1 is Palestine, within that 56 plus 1, you then have the Muslim Brotherhood, who plays an incredibly influential role within the OIC. So you can make a very strong argument that the Muslim Brotherhood has an enormous amount of power and influence in this whole agenda. And the creation of this agenda and the creation of policies that countries are going to have to abide by. And then you can really quickly then understand why there is a motion 103 regarding Islamophobia. Islamophobia being a made-up word by the Muslim Brotherhood, that everybody is, all these countries are expected to introduce into legislation specific to Muslims. So that's the connection there. Huge job loss. Well, of course, with the Paris Accord and the attack on energy, there's huge job loss. But obviously, throughout all of our industries, and I'm going to get into that here in a minute, but that's related to this whole attack on CO2 and our prosperity. Now, you can also relate huge job loss to decent work and economic growth. Now, this is interesting because decent work is relative, right? So if you take a whole bunch of jobs out of the oil and gas industry that was a good job and paid really good, and you replace that employment with, retail jobs and other low paying and low level type of work, well, you've replaced the jobs, but you haven't replaced the incomes. So, but that's okay, because within this agenda, it's all about equality. It's all about equality among and within countries. So they want all of the countries on the planet to be equal. And that means destroying Western civilization and all of the prosperity that we enjoy to make that the rest of the countries can be equal with us. Well, that means destruction of Western civilization, all to a lower level, so we're all on the same playing field. Incorporate immigration into that equation, and you get the reduction of wages, you get the reduction of good paying jobs tied into, all right, the attack on energy and the attack on mining and the attack on fishing and farming and ranching and manufacturing, and all of these jobs that traditionally played very well are being eliminated and replaced by what? Low paying, you know, terrible jobs, which is why a lot of our kids don't have a lot of hope, because they don't see a lot of opportunity. So that's how job loss is relative to this whole agenda. And I could spend a lot of time on how job loss is affected by this agenda, but I think you get the drift. Lower incomes, as I've mentioned, cost of living is rising, right? So because the West is expected to pay for this agenda, we have to pay more in taxes. But by also not on top of paying more taxes, all of the people that are providing consumer goods like food and gas and all of these things we depend on are also paying more. So the cost goes and gets transferred on to the consumer. So not only are we paying more in taxes, we're paying a carbon tax, but we're also paying more for all of the consumer goods we're purchasing, because they all cost more to make, to transport, to stock, to sell. And that cost always gets put onto the consumer. So there you go. While we have a rise in the cost of living, which means a lowering of the standard of living, we're also getting lower incomes. We also don't have the same jobs that we had or should be having in a prosperous, sovereign Canada. Then you have huge land grabs. We've seen this in BC. They do a lot of this land grabbing using the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP. So what they'll do is they'll partner with native groups in Canada, for example. In BC, there's a band of 200 Indians that are then given the responsibility to be responsible stewards of an enormous chunk of land that only they have access to, and the rest of the citizens of British Columbia will be prohibited or restricted from that area. So they'll use UNDRIP to achieve that goal. And of course, the natives, they think this is a great thing because they finally feel like they get their land back, but really they're just being used for the UN to achieve their goal. So we're seeing huge land grabs. We're also seeing private land being removed from people against their will, or they're just offered enough money that they're satisfied, so the government can reclaim that land and make it crown and do what they want with it. Now, there's an interesting thing going on as well. There's an idea of, sorry, my dogs are barking. There's an idea to, one second. So there's an idea that the globe should be 50-50, meaning 50% of all land on Earth be returned to the wild and 50% be dedicated for human population. And so that is an incredible goal to try to achieve, but it is relative to sustainable development. We get into sustainable cities, smart cities, which is where they want people that live in rural areas to move into the cities. They want to make rural living too expensive. They want to make rural living without the ability to actually make a living. It's being bought up by huge corporations, sending people into the city. And then you have cities who have then agreed to ICLEI and smart cities and 5G, so they can control the communication and they can essentially pack them and stack them. So funnel in as many people into the cities, make it as dense as possible, building upwards instead of outwards. And in Saskatchewan, that's foreign to us because we have nothing but land here. But this is what they've agreed to. This is what they want to do. So when you talk about land grabs, it's all relative to a number of these. Industry, innovation, infrastructure, again, relative. Life on land. This is another one of the goals that are directly related to that. You could make an argument somehow that good health and well-being is related to that issue, but it is without a question directly related to sustainable development. Land use prohibitions, as I mentioned, you're going to see more and more of that. They're going to be creating more and more national parks and areas that will be fully prohibited from human activity whatsoever. That's coming. There'll be more and more of that. And again, that's relative to a number of different goals of sustainable development. Carbon tax, carbon pricing. Of course, we're all upset about those things, and I've already spoken about that. That's relative to number 13 and the Paris Accord. But of course, that's just a mechanism to raise funds to fund the whole agenda. Loss of freedom of speech, again, we're relative to C16, but it is definitely impacted and related to sustainable development, because if there's too many people like myself and others who are opposed to this agenda and they start educating and rallying the communities and the people around them to the realities and the consequences of this agenda, they don't like that. They want that shut down. An example of an attack on free speech would be Don Cherry. Don Cherry represents toxic masculinity. Don Cherry represents old stock Canadian. Don Cherry represents tough, responsible, nationalist Canada. He's very much a patriot. He did not fit the bill. His language didn't fit the bill. And that particular discussion they were having was relative to immigration. And of course, they have to control that speech. In fact, the media company that he works for has committed to ensuring that their messaging is on board with the agenda. If you looked at the Migrant Compact, it said very clearly in the Migrant Compact that media will be trained in how to present this, that there should be no critique of this immigration and migration and refugees, to be very careful on how they present the information. Media companies are on board. So when you have someone with a high profile like Don Cherry speaking negatively about immigration or migrants or people coming in that don't understand the culture and don't wear a poppy, and he refers to them as you people, then that's a bad thing. That's why Sportsnet canned him. And so that's how it's freedom of speech is very much a huge part of them and how they're going to achieve their goals. They have to control the narrative. They have to have the media on board. They have to have people saying the right things in the public square, including our politicians. So when I tell you that every seat in Parliament in Ottawa is committed, they will not criticize development goals. They won't criticize the agenda. They won't criticize the Paris Accord. They're all on board. This is all relative to freedom of speech because they're all being told to say a certain thing in a certain way. Same as freedom of press. As I mentioned, there's a media compact, a global media compact where media companies have signed on and they agree to the narrative. They agree to protecting the narrative. They agree to not be critical of it, at least overtly. Then, of course, we have our Trudeau government, who has, of course, provided $622 million for media companies. So they continue to play ball. So that's the carrot. Then, of course, they have the stick after the carrot to make sure to keep them in line, which is the attack that we just saw the other day, where there won't be freedom of press, and they're actually considering licensing for these media companies. And they're not talking about the big ones because the big ones have already agreed. They've already signed on to this. They're talking about people like me, content creators, small independent news people. This is the people that they want and will be forced to license and register for ensure, because if you don't follow, their rules, then they'll just revoke your license and report you to whatever social media outlet that you're on, and they'll remove you from there without having proper license and registration. That's how that's going to work. So that's it, again, it's all so we cannot criticize or strongly oppose the sustainable development goals and achieving those goals by 2030. Loss of parental rights. We're seeing this. And again, this will be relative to gender equality. It'll be relative to education. It'll be relative to reduced inequalities. It'll be relative to a number. Because as we see with the transgender movement and having little boys convert to being girls or having little girls convert to being boys and irrevocably changing their anatomy, at making these decisions at an age they shouldn't be making their decisions, and we have parents who want to protect their kids from the decisions those kids are going to make that will harm them for the rest of their life. As we are seeing in this case in BC, we have that father who just wants to protect his child from a terrible decision that'll affect his child for the rest of their life, and he's not allowed to do that. In fact, he's lost his freedom of speech. We have lost our freedom of press because we can't interview him. He's lost his freedom of speech or his freedom of expression because he can't express what's happened. So it's completely stomped on. And his parental rights have been completely stomped on, even though we believe and he believes strongly that he is righteous in wanting to protect his kid from transgenderism and the promotion of it. Again, as an adult, if you want to be and dress and act a certain way, if you want to go for some kind of surgery on your own accord, you're more than free to do so. I don't care what you do with your body. Most people don't. But this isn't about that. This is about our children. This is about protecting our children. As parents, we have that responsibility. We should have that right. Those rights are being dismantled as we speak. And again, it's all relative to the Sustainable Development Agenda. If you go to the UN and just type in UN Transgender Agenda, boom, you'll see it there. Type in LGBTQ UN, you'll see that. SOGI. SOGI is, of course, falls under education. This is where the indoctrination comes in. This is how it gets into our school system. This is how they indoctrinate our kids. This is how they confuse our kids. This is how they promote to our kids that it's fine to change yourself chemically and biologically, and you have that right over and above your parents' wishes. This is where this all comes from. LGBT, of course, they want to add the P, and the promotion of pedophiles and pedophilia. Of course, we know how the UN has been very involved in pedophilia. There's UN pedophile rings. There's UN rape gangs. There's, all you have to do is search Google and it'll come up. But of course, that's also relative to gender equality, reduced inequalities, quality education, good health, well-being. So that's where all of this is relative to the Sustainable Development Agenda. Of course, the sexualization of children. We see, drag kids on CBC. We see transgender taking care of young children and doing speeches at schools and telling them it's all good. Dancing with kids, rolling on the floor with kids. You see gay pride parades with these people, and there's kids there and they're gyrating and they have these costumes, these sex costumes. Well, it's all sexualization of children. And it's all, the destruction of morals and our moral fabric. And this is all connected to the UN Sustainable Development Agenda. Abortion, of course, is another thing that they're using, and this isn't relative to the population control and reducing the world's population. But what they're doing is they're telling people in the West that we should have less kids. Meanwhile, they're importing people by the millions to our country. So it's population replacement. And one of the ways they do that is through abortion. And again, this is relative to reduced inequalities. They want all countries to be the same. They don't want, this Western civilized world to be what it represents. They want all countries to be equal. So one of the ways they're going to do that is through population replacement and reduction. You could also relate that to responsible consumption and production, because it's controlling essentially how much food is going to be consumed and who's consuming it and what they're consuming. It's relative to sustainable cities. And ultimately, if you want a population that's easy to control, you remove masculinity, you remove this sense of freedom and liberty that the Western civilized world has promoted so much and protected so much to this point. You have to remove those pillars to achieve your goal of being able to control a society. And you also replace that society with people from societies who are used to being controlled or submissive or submitted to a particular religion, which of course is Islam. And that's why we're seeing most of the immigration coming from the Middle East and North Africa, because those are the folks that when they come and they live in their ghettos, they're easily controlled. They're easily put on welfare, dependent on the government. The government can then tell them what to do, and they'll be submissive because their first and foremost goal is to be a good Muslim and representative of Allah and Muhammad. And so it's very easy to control those people because their primary focus is their religion. All else doesn't matter. So it's much easier to control a group of people like that than it is a group of people who are used to freedom and liberty and justice and all of these things we cherish in Western civilization and in Canada. And of course, you have disrespecting our veterans. Well, that runs against toxic masculinity. That runs against Western civilization values. Generally speaking, the military is a masculine entity. It's really where our warriors are, and that's not to say that women aren't warriors, but obviously there's far more men. It's generally speaking, a man's game to go fight in a war. Again, that doesn't exclude the few women that can do the same job as our regular soldiers, but let's just be honest, predominantly it's male orientated. So they don't want to treat our veterans with any more respect than they absolutely have to. Of course, there is when we look at sustainable development and its creation and who created it, of course, that represents colonialism. They're attacking the quote unquote colonialism, Western civilization. And part of that, of course, is our military. So we don't want to, look at the Afghan monument or memorial in Ottawa. It's not even open to the general public. We can't even go and pay homage to our soldiers who served in Afghanistan because that would hurt somebody's feelings. So they hide it in a building. Even when they opened it up, not even the families of veterans who were lost in Afghanistan were invited to attend that event, because again, you're offending, of course, the good soldiers and of the Taliban and Al Qaeda and all of those other wonderful groups. So why would we don't want to offend those people, so we're just going to bury it. So it's all related. Promotion of terrorism. Of course, you have Cotter, who gets paid $10.5 million because he was a poor child soldier who made IEDs and giggled when he did it. IEDs that most likely killed many Canadians and Americans, who then went on to kill an American sergeant by the name of Christopher Scheer. But yet we pay him $10.5 million because of all of the horrible things that happened to him because he went to jail because he's a terrorist. And then, of course, we bring him back to Canada, and now he's on a speaking tour, and he's celebrated as, this wonderful human being. Yay, fantastic. Meanwhile, they don't talk about his dad, who was good friends with Osama bin Laden. We don't talk about his family. We don't talk about Boyle. We don't talk about any of the things, the nefarious things that the Cotter family and Omar Cotter himself are involved in. No, we ignore all that, and we just, use him as an example of, yay, he was a child soldier and we've saved him. So again, relative to the overall agenda of destruction of Western civilization, and of course the denouncement of colonialism and all of that bad stuff that we have done in the past and in the history. And to move forward, we must, with this agenda, we must promote this terrorists and denounce any activity that we are part of, however proud we could be about those things. Lawfare, of course, if you go against any of these things, if you go against terrorists, or you go against abortion, or you go against transgenderism, or Islamism, or any of the number of issues that are related to sustainable development, they'll come at you with lawfare, which simply means the act of suing you is the punishment, because you have to defend yourself, and that costs a lot of money, and you'll be destroyed. So, of course, they hope everyone will just shut up. And so lawfare is heavily used in our system by all our parties. We just saw, right in the last couple of days, we saw Laura Lynn run through court, told to shut up. She's talking about the father out of BC, and she got this deplatformed off social media for it. Her videos got taken down. She got ordered to attend court. We also seeing it now. Waleed Solomon, who is a Islamist and has close relations and close ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, he just put out a threatening letter to Daniel Boardman, who called him out on his ties, and he happens to be the campaign manager for Aaron O'Toole. Aaron O'Toole is running for the leadership of the Conservative Party, who has, obviously close ties to Waleed because it's his campaign manager. It's just, or campaign chair, sorry. So even the Conservative Party of Canada is now using lawfare to stifle any opposition or any critique. Endless regulation. Of course, we're getting regulated to death. There is no free market anymore. It's all crony capitalism and corporate welfare. Dairy cartel. It's all, state influenced and state run. And so there's lots of corruption. There's lots of deals made between groups, representative groups and corporations with government. Play ball, we'll be nice, you'll get contracts. Don't play ball, you won't get contracts, you'll be finished. So again, it's all part of this attack on free market and everything Western civilized countries cherish. But of course, with all of these goals will come more and more and more regulation in order for them to be able to achieve their goals. And this regulation, you'll see it across the board. Pretty much all of these, you will be regulated in one form or another. So all 17 of these are related to the regulations that are in place, proposed to be in place, or in the future. It's all relative and all related to the sustainable development. I mean, if you look at Trudeau's policies that he put in place in his first 4-year term, all of them are relative to the sustainable development goal. Each and every one is relative. Look at the acts, C-48, C-69, C-16, M-103, C-71. They're all relative to sustainable development agenda. His whole mandate is related to sustainable development agenda, which is why he can refer to us as a post-nation state, because of their commitment to all of these goals. And to achieving these goals, you have to give up your sovereignty in order to achieve them. That's why he referred to us as the first post-nation state. Loss of property rights. Okay, again, that goes to not only physical property like your land. If you buy a house in Saskatoon, you'll no longer, it's coming, you'll no longer, under the urban agenda and under ICLEI, You'll no longer be able to trim your own trees. You'll no longer be able to remove a tree. Even if you have this property it's been in your family and it's your tree and you planted it, doesn't matter. It's going to change. You're going to have to need permitting and licensing and approval to either remove that tree or to prune it. You'll need licensing for that. So it's really not your property. They just tell you you're basically renting it. And paying taxes on it, but it's not really yours. This goes for suburban property as well. Not only does it go just to suburban, like your suburbs, but it goes to acreages and farms as well, especially if there's water on that property. If there's water on that property, the government will come in and restrict what you can do with that water, how you're going to develop your land based on that water. So we have life on land, it's relative to climate change, it's relative to sustainable cities, it's relative to responsible consumption and production, it's relative to industry, it's relative. So it's relative. This property rights is relative in a lot of ways. Then we get into specifics of gun rights, of course, gun prohibition. I spoke of that already with C-71, but there's more legislation coming. And I guess, again, it's related to UNOTA and the Small Arms Treaty and the de-arming of societies and countries and so on. So we have a big fight there. Again, all relative to sustainable development agenda. Ultimately, with what they want to do, all we have to do is look to Venezuela and other countries like that where they came in with socialist government or communist government. First thing they did was remove firearms from the masses, from the populace, because without firearms, they're much easier to control and much easier to implement all of the goals of sustainable development. So they must remove these firearms, especially when it comes to what they call stockpiling. And that just means, it'll be limited to how many guns you can have, because God forbid you have 3, you might be able to share it with somebody. And if you have to defend yourself against the state, you won't be able to do that. So that's why they're coming back. They understand that the consequences to all of these goals is going to be enormous and immense, and the reaction is going to be horrible. People are going to be upset. They're going to be fired up. They're going to be angry. And it's going to come to a point where there may be some sort of rebellion or revolution to fight back if we don't change our government and the direction it's going in the very near future. A hijack education system, of course, I've already spoken to that. That calls under quality education. There is a common core that they want to put out. They want the same narrative, the same indoctrination to all kids around the world, and have that same. They want everyone dumbed down. They want everybody indoctrinated, so they're easy to manage. Instead of cherishing freedom and liberty, they're going to be promoting the idea of the state being in control of everything, and a nanny state, beta boys, and the emasculation of boys and men. It's all part and relative to sustainable development agenda, which of course is the same as indoctrination of our children. Then we see, of course, the rise of political Islam. We have Islamists that have infiltrated the Liberal Party. We've had Islamists that have infiltrated the Conservative Party. They are in every other establishment party with concerted and goals and effort to get into the political system and to have their people live in ghettos and enclaves so they can ensure that their people will get elected and get voted. This is why the Conservative Party panders to that group. This is why the Liberals pander to those groups. This is why you see newspapers in these communities, all from other countries, promoting and encouraging people to vote Liberal. This is why they're doing it. But political Islam is the most pervasive of all of the religious groups, and they are 3% of our population in Canada. Maybe it's more now, maybe it's 4%, but they are by far the loudest and the most active, because they understand, and this is how they've managed to get through into Europe and to get elected there, to change policy, to change laws. So they're very active, and it's very, very dangerous for our country, as it has been for many others. And so again, relative to sustainable development, when you look at who has created a lot of these policies and a lot of this, ultimately it's attack on Western civilization. And the Islamists, of course, are trying to capitalize on this situation, the weakening of Western civilization, so they can, as Islamists who are supremacist in their ideology, they believe that they need to establish a worldwide caliphate. So they're using all of this to jump on it, to take control. And one of the ways they'll do that is, of course, through political Islam, through political entryism, and get into our system to change things from within. Very important and very relative. Mass migration, of course, we've spoken about that already. That's definitely related to a lot of these. And of course, two of the pacts that have been developed is the Migrant Pact, which we're all familiar with. And then there's also the Refugee Compact, which people are less familiar with, but far more dangerous to our country, because the exposure through the Refugee Compact is much greater to Canada than the Migration Pact is, because most of the migration comes from the States. And by the time that enormous migration coming up, Donald Trump is already stopping it. So we're not going to see that influx on our borders quite as much. The only reason we saw it in the last few years is because Donald Trump's attitude toward mass migration. So those people wanted to come to a much friendlier country when it comes to supporting these migrants and refugees. But what's the greater danger to our country is the Refugee Pact, which refugees en masse can be shipped or flown to Canada, and Canada will have been dictated to as to how many refugees and where they're coming from, and it'll be directed, and our sovereignty, of course, is further ceded to this UN agenda, which, of course, relative to migration, as we discussed before, reduced inequalities, and the overall no poverty, no hunger approach and goals, to ensure that, again, all countries are equal and everyone has the equal opportunity for food and employment and education and all these other things, but they want it equal across the board. And so we know what happens when we try to achieve equality through policy or legislation. That then becomes, of course, equality of outcome rather than of opportunity. And that's a recipe for disaster, but they don't care because it's part of their socialist collective agenda of equality across the world. And we're in for a big world of hurt. Cultural genocide, of course, that's part of it. Again, we've talked about this already, but it's Western civilization and the culture that we cherish, the culture of freedom, liberty, justice, equality under the law, tolerance, all of these things that we all cherish, responsibility, hard work, all of these as Canadians we identify with. This is what they want to destroy, because all of those things that we cherish are the exact things they need to go after to achieve all of these goals. Toxic masculinity, we've talked about that. Corporate welfare, crony capitalism, we've mentioned that. So that's relative, of course, very relative to the sustainable development goals. When you talk about corporate welfare and crony capitalism, they have another compact called the Global Compact, and that's relative very much to number 17, partnerships for the goals. This is where they get the multinationals, the big corporations to get on board, so they can take advantage and crony capitalize on the situation created by this agenda. And of course, when you have a globe that's opening up to consumerism and energy and these other things that are required. These crony capitalists want to capitalize on that. So you see this merge of socialism and capitalism, where it's not, of course, real capitalism. It's not a free market. It's a controlled market. It's a globally controlled market. It's essentially becomes fascism when you have the state basically, working with multinational corporations to control the masses. 100% relative to this. Very important part of this, actually, this whole agenda is to have that corporate welfare and crony capitalism, to have them on board. And you can see companies. I just read an article today, the cooperators co-op here in Saskatchewan. If you go down to the bottom of their website, they talk about sustainability and achieving the goals and playing a part as a strong partner in achieving those goals. You see it right there, which is interesting because on the flip side, Unifor, of which the two are fighting right now over contract negotiations, Unifor also on their website promotes the idea of sustainable development agenda. So that's kind of an interesting sidebar. Of course, higher taxes, we've talked about that. In order to fund this, they require more taxes, and that's why we're seeing more taxes. Bought off media, we've talked about that now. Mentioned that earlier with the Global Media Compact and how the media is used to protect the narrative and to protect the messaging and to repeat the messaging over and over. That's why it's so prevalent these days, more so than any other time. You have the media regurgitating the language that the UN wants them to regurgitate so they can achieve these goals. Again, I spoke about it before, so I won't go too far into it. Then, of course, the destruction of our industries, energy, big attack on energy, mining, same, manufacturing, fishing, logging, farming, ranching, all being attacked, all being decimated. Right back, to the 80s when the fishing industry on the East Coast was decimated. And of course, it's being heavily regulated and controlled on the West Coast. And then, of course, logging, all of these things are being attacked, and it's all 100% relative to sustainable development agenda, i.e. industry, innovation, and infrastructure. So they're creating policy to control our industries, to decimate our industries. And it's also relative to goal number 8, decent work and economic growth. It's also relative to number 7, affordable and clean energy. It's relative to sustainable cities. It's very much relative to this whole agenda. And really, all of these goals are connected, right? So they're not an individual thing. It's all part of the greater sustainable development agenda. They're all connected. And then all of the aspects and targets of these are connected. But these are the issues that are created by these goals, by trying to achieve these goals. This is why we're seeing destruction of these industries in our country. Generally, good business to be in, generally a good employers to work for, the solid wages, good benefits, those are all going away because of this agenda. Again, changing the anthem, so they're going after our culture. They're going after, again, it's relative to gender equality. And of course, it's part of the narrative, it's part of the conditioning, it's part of the indoctrination to remove in all thy sons command to in all of us command. That's why it was important. People had a visceral response to it that they didn't want our anthem changed. They thought it was ridiculous, but it's worse than that. It's related to these goals. It's related to achieving these goals, and it's related to a foreign entity dictating how we do business in our country, up to and including changing our national anthem. And Don Cherry, of course, firing him. I mentioned him earlier. That scenario with the media and controlling messaging and the narrative, they just couldn't have that. Plus, of course, toxic masculinity and white heterosexual old man bad. Of course, they're targeting hockey shortly thereafter. Ron McLean and the few there jumped on hockey. Then after a few more times, they jumped on hockey, and the culture of hockey is bad. You had the the View Canada with the social, whatever the socialists that show, basically putting out the narrative that most hockey players are white and white is bad. White hockey is even worse. It's terrible. So that's just another way to attack our culture, to attack everything that we cherish. And one of the things that really unites us is the game of hockey. How do we destroy that unity while we attack one element of that precious game? And that's the men who play it and the boys who play it. And of course, that's related to gender equality as well, because you see heavy promotion of female hockey. Even we just saw the All-Star game where they have to include now for the last couple of years the women hockey players, which is interesting because it's an NHL All-Star game. But we have to include them in everything. And this is coming from sustainable development. Bike lanes, people are pissed off about bike lanes. Well, this is where it comes from. It's part of the urban agenda. They prioritize cycling and pedestrians and cyclists over traditional transportation, your personal vehicle, to get you to work. Even though it's minus 40 in the winter, they're telling you to ride your bike. So eventually they want to get to the point where nobody drives their car downtown. They want everyone using electric buses, bicycles, or their feet to get to and from downtown. So there'll be heavy restrictions. That's why they want to eliminate some roads and replace them with bike lanes. It's social engineering is what it is. And it's all, again, part of moving people into the cities, sustainable cities and communities, off of rural areas and into the cities where they're much easily controlled. And it's all relative, again, to sustainable development. It's all connected. The whole no meat thing, again, that's back to the industry and attacking ranching. But of course, it's another way to attack sort of masculinity and the idea of hunting and feeding ourselves and being self-reliant. It's all related. It's also social engineering, where they create a product like this Beyond Meat product that you see in your grocery stores and every fast food chain that jumped on it, offering it when there was no demand. They created the supply and then tried to socially engineer the demand. And they're failing at it, thankfully, but this is what they try to do. So they try to socially engineer that demand and then provide the supply first. So it's all social engineering. Again, it falls back. The reason why they're doing it is this life on land, climate action, sustainable cities. It's all related, and this is where it all comes from. So everything that you have seen, and I'll just read what I wrote, every single one of these issues is directly related to one or many of the 17 goals of sustainable development and its 169 targets. Every single one. All of these issues that I just went through, every single one that pisses everybody off, doesn't matter what part of Canada you're from, every one of these issues is directly the cause and related to sustainable development agenda. All of them. There's probably some I've missed, and maybe if somebody's watching, they can identify in the comments below. But it's all related. Every last one of them. This is globalism, folks. This is sustainable development. This is why all of these things are happening. It's social engineering. It's socialism on a global scale. It's redistribution of wealth. And it's going to get a lot worse. They have these goals that they want to reach by 2030. That's 10 years from now. It's just getting started. This is a war. It's a war against Western civilization. It's a war against freedom, liberty, justice, equality under the law. It's capitalism. It's a war against all of that. It's a war against the free market. It's a war against all of these things that we cherish and hold dear. Please, folks, understand what this means, what the consequences are to this agenda. It's too important to ignore. It's too important to micro-protest these issues specifically. Understand it is the head of the snake. UN Sustainable Development Agenda is the head of the snake that's creating all of these issues I listed, every last one of them and more. Anytime you find anything that's somewhat controversial, relate it to sustainable development. If you're questioning it, just Google whatever the issue is plus UN, or Google whatever the issue is plus sustainable development. You'll find the answer. It'll be right there. Whether it's transgenderism, whether it's meat, whether it's guns, whether it's pipelines, it doesn't matter. It's all relative. Just Google it. You'll find it. You'll relate it to this, and you'll have your answer. It's all connected. There's one head of the snake. We need to get a government that will cut that head of the snake off the snake, and that'll be the end of it, and we'll have our country back. Until we do that, we're going to feel an incredible amount of pain, and there'll be an incredible amount of consequences to this agenda for countries like ours. Anyways, that's what I wanted to do today. I hope you've learned something. I hope this has helped you understand what this means to our country and how it's related and how it's affecting every aspect of your life. So I hope it's helped. Please share it. Please like it. Please comment in the bottom. And if there's anything I left out, by all means, mention it in the comments. I'm going to do another video with a PowerPoint that's somewhat similar to this, but more specific to some things. So stay tuned for that. But I hope you enjoyed the video. Again, please share it. Share it with people in your family. Share it with people you work with. Share it with folks whenever you can. It's important that people understand and they connect these dots, because if we can all connect the dots and identify the UNSDA as the head of the snake, we will be able to defeat this and get our country back and stop all this nonsense. So anyways, ciao for now.